Good morning, everybody. My name is Holly Kuzmich. I'm executive director of the Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas, and am here with two either current or former state chiefs.
For one more month.
John has one more month in his job as the superintendent in Louisiana, and has spent, John, 8 years there?
8 or 9, yeah, between 8 and 9.
Yeah, which is a very long tenure in the world of state chiefs. Hanna Skandera spent 6 years as the chief state school officer in New Mexico. So these two, have spent a lot of time in the trenches thinking about students in their states and preparing them for the workforce. And part of what we're going to dive into today is this whole connection point and gulf between policy world and the private sector and the workforce, and how do we think about connecting the two more significantly. And in full disclosure, John and Hanna and I are working on a project together, which you'll hear us talk about a little bit today, to think about how we create a state-level dashboard that starts in the workforce and starts in young adulthood and looks backwards into the education system and looks at how well we're doing state by state in preparing students for the workforce. And one of the themes of this is we don't have very good data to even talk about this issue. So Hanna and John, I want to start there. You, in your experience as state chiefs, talk a little bit about the state of data. What was there, what was not there, how do you use it, what are the big gaps?
Yeah. I'll kick off, and my first reflection, even before talking about the state of data, which is abysmal, so it's a little bit depressing, is I think when we have this conversation and try and connect education, employability, success in life over time, and engaged citizens, we often start at the beginning, not the end. And what I mean by that is we should start thinking about what's the end? What is our end goal? And work backwards, as Holly said. And until we do that, we are committed to the silos that we currently live in, which is, we've got this K12 world, and if we graduate kids, we'll feel better. And the more our grad rates go up, which I am a big advocate of, the better off we're doing. But the handoffs, where we lose so many kids along the way because we're so siloed, are creating a really big gap in the end game. And so to reflect on my time in New Mexico, I'll never forget 3 years in a row, sitting in a room, multiple meetings in the governor's office with 4 different cabinet secretaries saying, how do we connect the dots between pre-K, K-12, workforce, higher ed, and beyond? And it was, there are words that I can't use on stage. It was crazy. And we were unable and unsuccessful at connecting those dots, even with great intentionality. So what's available? In my spot as a state chief, K-12 data was available. What wasn't available is how do we connect these through lines and have a real conversation about where we want our kids to be, not just at the end of 12th grade, but beyond.
Yeah, no, I mean, I echo all of that. And I do think that first, this, by the way, has been a great couple of days. I think that the K-12 part of this, of the kind of talent pipeline, has been less discussed. And that's sad, as Secretary Duncan said last night, because as many kids as we're graduating, we're leaving a lot of kids the day after they graduate without something particularly concrete. And we have this opportunity youth focus. There need not be millions of opportunity youth if we had actually a real bridge from high school into an upwardly mobile life after high school. Part of the reason that bridge that Hanna talks about has not been built is that the law, the federal law, is the predominant influence in the way that schools think about their jobs and the way that states think about their roles as regulators and the way that school systems think about their jobs as school operators. And it was a good law. No Child Left Behind was a very, very good and important step. But it is time to go beyond that and actually think about the long-term outcomes of young people as an indicator of what their schools have put into those young people. And until we get their schools, especially high schools, will never value the long-term outcomes of their kids at scale and with nuance until we build those systems. And so part of the reason that we've engaged in this, what I'd call a prototyping kind of project, is to actually begin to demonstrate that you can have reasonable and reliable ways of looking at outcomes that go beyond high school graduation as a way of validating a state or a school system or a school.
Talk a little bit, John, about your original, you came to us and talked to us about this project because you're a competitive guy, and you talked about what you had and sort of spurred this. Can you share that with the crowd? And
Yeah, well,
what
I think there's
hoping to drive?
There's two issues that relevant to how we can better use data at a high level, at the macro level, to drive the K-12 system in the direction that this meeting has embodied. First is the measures themselves. I think and certainly last night's discussion was indicative of this. The high school diploma is a good thing, it's an important thing to measure, but it certainly does not tell a whole story. And so we need to start driving a more robust discussion of what are the right measures of success for high schools in particular. But also, if what we go to people in my job and Hanna's job and the state legislatures around the country and the governors around the country, if what we go to them with is, well, here's one report on your NAEP, here's one report on your graduation, here's a yearly report on whether your fourth graders can read or not, we're giving them a kind of inchoate, non-comprehensive, and frankly, very, very limited set of incentives around which they make policies. And so there's a reason why most people in our jobs also, just like high school principals, aren't deeply concerned with building bridges to last mile providers, to community colleges, and even to four-year institutions. And it's because they have no incentives to do that within the way that they're evaluated. So we have to start creating better measures and using them to leverage state and local policymakers if we're actually going to play our role as the start of the funnel.
I'm just going to tag team with that and say, I think part of the thing we have to do, and some of what happens here in these conversations, is change the conversation. The paradigm, like I said, is siloed, and we incentivize. We're getting actually what we incentivize right now in our traditional systems. And until we shift our paradigm and the data, and then align our funding with that, I think we'll continue to chomp around the edges in many respects. But the first thing we need to do is talk about how we shift that.
What would you tell this crowd that we're incentivizing now?
Butts and seats. That was a little raw. Seat time. We are saying at the end of the day, hey, if a kid, whether it's in K-12 and frankly, or in higher ed, we're going to pay based on the fact that you're there, instead of what happened while this student was there. What's the end game? The ISA conversation earlier, and are we actually getting a return on the investment? I think about K-12, and most states spend over 40% of their state budget on K-12. 40%. And New Mexico is 43%. That's not higher ed, actually. It's just K-12. What are we getting in return for what we're investing?
Yeah, and I think, let's be real about the federal law. The federal law that really determines now the academic program for the bulk of the day in K through 12 schools, that comes up for reauthorization, let's say once a decade. So you get one crack at it. And in 2015, the Obama administration and Congress at that time passed a law that literally included no advancements on the way we think about accountability over No Child Left Behind, which was perhaps done for the right reasons at that moment in time to kind of bury the hatchet on the Common Core, get the federal government, at least optically, out of accountability. Not genuinely, but optically out of it. But it said basically we're going to take a pause on developing any new way of thinking about evaluating schools and basically just put the No Child Left Behind framework in a kinder, gentler kind of legislation. Well, that was a big swing and miss, because what that basically said is, for all of this knowledge that we've gleaned about how to run better high schools, about the intersection of high schools and work, we're going to do nothing to codify the advancement of the measures by which high schools are evaluated in the law. And so you still have today thousands and thousands of high schools that are largely focused exclusively on basic reading and math and whether they can get kids across the goal line, which is a credit hour, Carnegie unit, seat time type deal for them. And that's a serious, serious miss. So the question I think for us is, as a K-12 system and frankly as industry and higher education too, in the next 5 years, whenever it is that law not just comes up for reauthorization, but the politics are such that we can credibly reauthorize it, are we going to be ready to give Congress examples of measures that actually work to evaluate school performance at scale, rural and urban, red and blue, in ways that take high school principals' incentives and local superintendents' incentives beyond the day the kid walks across the dais and gets a diploma? And we have to start building those measures now, or else Congress is going to be in the same position with nothing to say other than grad rates and standardized tests.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit, but I want to expand on it. This prototype we're working on starts in young adulthood and looks at how many people are working, what's their wage, are they in the military, are they in school, are they doing something productive, and then goes backwards down into the system. Why'd we start there? Why is that important? And talk a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, I would just say for too long we haven't looked with the end in mind, and we had our discrete, like I said, siloed approach. And I think this is an opportunity to serve up the conversation and the through line between pre-K all the way into are you voting and are you volunteering and are you making a living wage, et cetera. And I also think we've got some serious fatigue across the country around K12. I think about governors who really, they took it in the shorts. They went out there and they fought hard, and the return, whether it was political or actual or both, wasn't very high for most of them. And I think one of the things I'm excited about in thinking about this prototype is how do we begin to say this is not just a K-12 conversation, it's not just a higher ed conversation, it's not just a pre-K conversation. It is about thriving citizens who are contributing economically, who have that upward mobility that this generation and the one before lost compared to their parents. When we think about 1940, I know that's ways back, and 90%, according to Raj Chetty, of kids were surpassing their parents with upward mobility, and now we're below 50%. How do we reverse that trend? And I think it starts with a conversation, data, and then the actions to actually begin to shift into a much broader end game.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point about broadening it, there's this sort of an irony of having the commissioners of Louisiana and New Mexico up here. I mean, you're talking about like my buddy number 47 and I'm 48 over here. So you know, I think on one hand you could say, well, that's demonstrative of the fact that these are places with tremendous challenges who have yet to resolve those challenges, social and educational. But on the other hand, you could say, well, is that really reflective of what's happening in those places fully? Or is there a broader range, as Hanna says, of stuff that policymakers, superintendents and otherwise, should be doing to advance life gains? Because your 4th grade and your 8th grade NAEP scores are really, really important as measures of whether we're doing an adequate job at teaching kids to read and do basic math, which in some respects is the most important thing we do. But if you were also interested in, is there upward mobility happening in your state for young adults? Are young adults actually being availed of opportunity, and are they connecting with opportunity? You do a whole bunch of different stuff other than work with colleges of education on training teachers or getting good curriculum in your 5th grades. You'd, for example, do things like focus on FAFSA completion, which we've done a lot of. We didn't do that because there was any incentive system out there to do it, and that's a problem. Now there actually is one on FAFSA completion because every state is very visibly ranked and there's this kind of competition on FAFSA completion, which is great. But that's just one example of stuff you would do if you had a longer term goal in mind, and we think we need to begin doing that for states.
Can you paint the picture a little bit on what the silos look and feel like at the state level between K-12 and post-secondary and workforce in your experience?
I started by saying I have this almost PTSD of sitting in a governor's office with 4 different cabinet secretaries saying, how do we do this? And do we have the data? Can we align it? Can we create a through line? And we literally spent 4 years trying to get to that. And then we had a gubernatorial shift and the conversation stopped, right? So super frustrating, nonsensical in many ways. But I would still say, until we get to that space where we can actually say, you know what, here are these kiddos that started in our pre-K program, and here's what we're seeing where they are when they're 22 years old. Everything from how they're contributing and participating or not, and then look back and say, what were those things all along the way that tell a story? Some of them we know, right? But I think there's a whole nother level of conversation that we can have about the story and the things that we can learn when we can start connecting those dots. And I mean, if I had to give one word for what was that like in the state chief role, frustrating. Just we weren't there.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I've worked in 3 administrations. I worked for Mike Bloomberg and Joel Klein. In New York City, I worked in the Bobby Jindal administration in Louisiana, and I work now for a Democrat governor, John Bell Edwards, and his administration. And I can tell you that you see within that the full range of management acumen within governments. And certainly in one of those administrations, there was extraordinarily tight communication among the workforce side, the 2-year side, the 4-year side, and the K-12 side. They thought of themselves as a team, and the lead manager of that administration was a manager, and he thought of managing the government not unlike managing in the private sector. That's turns out not the way it typically is. And even in the states that are highlighted as kind of shining stars of higher education reform and workforce reform, like Tennessee and Colorado, even in the best cases, it is so rare to see tight alignment across those systems, either because the governor and his or her team have not quite an understanding of it themselves, and it's just painful to think about managing, or because the political incentives, even for them, are not to touch the sacred cows that the cabinet secretaries represent. And so until we start to change the incentives for everybody in the government around what does success look like, you won't get even governors to actually, I believe, focus on managing their divisions as teams and as one seamless system of people development.
Mm-hmm. And I would just also say that's one reason I'm really excited about this prototyping we're looking at is, could we actually in one spot have, I'm going to use loose words, a scorecard that actually begin to tell that story for each governor, for each state, where they can look, and I've had a few conversations with governors about this prototype and this idea, and it's really interesting. Their reactions are divided. Some are, well, that means we're going to be compared to other states, and I'm not sure I like that. That makes me nervous. And then there's the what I consider front-running, leading governors who are like, bring it. This is what we need to begin to have the conversations that actually create a real ability to compare and ask ourselves the tough questions, and we can all ask them at once.
It's always interesting to come to a conference like this where it's heavily private sector, fewer of the policy types. We often go to conferences that are heavily the policy types and very few private sector. How do you think about that gulf and how we start to overcome some of that? What's behind it?
I was sitting in my chair and I was chuckling, thinking, okay, I love that it feels like we're chomping around the edges. And I think that's how entrepreneurialism, starts. You start this and it builds, and the momentum and the snowball hopefully gets large enough to hit the real system. But I would say, there are 50 million kids in our K-12 system today. And they're gonna land somewhere and be a part of something, we hope. And how do we begin to bridge is my question. How do we begin to say, how do we take these entrepreneurial ideas, which I love and geek out on, and then I go home, and I'm now on the community college a system board in Colorado, and go, all right, how do we start pushing this envelope in the systems that are relatively entrenched? So I think one of the challenges and the opportunities, Deb, that you bring to this is this opportunity to push the envelope on both ends. Someone was up here on a panel earlier, and I'm going to paraphrase, but made the comment like, hey, I'm not even going to touch that. And I had this moment of, I get it, but we need you to push.
Yeah, I think there are certainly businesses represented in this room that have done an effective job of penetrating the K-12 fortress. And have largely, I think the ones that I'm aware of, have become in their community or across the country a part of the fabric of K-12 schooling. They're part of the culture of it. However, if you're not part of it, the ability, as many people here have lived, to get in and make yourself a part of it is horrible. And we are, as an industry, horrifically averse to good private sector partnerships and consumption in ways that help us be better at our jobs. So you have a question. Do you try to build the type of connectivity that we're describing to higher education and to the workforce down into the K-12 system and wrestle with issues of scheduling, of school-based budgets or district-based budgets, for example? And I think that is an important but very, very long-term piece of work that right now is only nibbling on the edges. Early college courses, online work in high schools, genuine industry-based credentialing and micro-credentialing. I mean, these in high schools, there are shining stars, but they are very few. I have come to think, though, that the faster and more immediately disruptable spaces are summers and the space immediately following high school. And in a way, it is the space for which we are least morally accountable and also are least resourced, but it is the space when young people realize they are in the greatest state of vulnerability and need, and where there isn't a bureaucracy that's laying claim to their every waking hour. Literally, the day after they walk across this stage, there's nobody funding them, but there's also nobody telling them what to do, and they know it. And that's a sad thing, because we all talk about the Swiss systems and these others that have much more functional ways of thinking about exiting high school. I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon, not soon enough to address the moral crisis that is tens and tens of thousands of kids who either are accruing debt every year, hundreds of thousands, or the other side of the debt equation, which is they believe they should simply accept low-wage work because they don't either have a future in higher education or they're not interested in the debt. That's just as bad. I mean, going to work at Taco Bell with no degree and no future of a degree is just as bad as the debt problem. And so what is it that we're going to do? Because the only institution that I've seen for our kids at scale that works to avoid both of those paths for the kid who's not immediately bound for a four-year institution is the military. And there is no civilian equivalent of the military that recruits students, that selects them, that equips them with mindsets, that trains them immediately after high school graduation, and that places them into upwardly mobile work. And in a way, I think if I were thinking about this broader connection we're talking about, I think the most disruptible space, the space that's rife with the fastest potential, is the day after high school graduation.
Okay, can you each put a little color behind how you use or used data at the state level to drive really important policy decisions and then, of course, affect outcomes for kids? Sometimes it feels so ethereal, right? And we're gonna look at states and see how well they're doing, but unless it drives some significant action and changes outcomes for kids, it's all just a grade and a ranking.
Yeah. So in New Mexico, and not unlike John, I also worked in California, Florida, and in DC. And so I would say in each one of these spots, to the degree that you had spheres of influence and capacity, my goal was to take data and break it down from here's our state level data, but then how do we just unpack it for each party that should be interested, meaning whether it's our business leaders, what's the impact and how do we begin to have this conversation, and literally did reports for our business leaders around our state, whether it's our legislators, did unique individualized legislative reports for every single legislator to begin to connect the dots and say, so you're not sitting in your chair when you're voting on something saying, well, our state's not doing well, but I'm good. And shifting that conversation to, well, here's your data, and here's whether it's going up or down on whether it's grad rates, proficiency levels. Attendance was actually a really big issue in New Mexico. And so just and linking that to how our kids were doing, but then starting to unpack all the way down to, we created a unique tool for parents in English and in Spanish that they were able to download on their phones so they could begin to see how the connection all the way to their child. And we actually gave them specific, actionable things they could do to support their child. So the more personal we were able to make it, the more effective we found it was in driving change and actual action.
Yeah, I mean, government is a one player in a much bigger equation. So I don't think we should overstate the ability of governors or state chiefs and legislatures to determine life outcomes. But I do think that people who run governments should see that they have a continuum of services for which the government has assumed responsibility, meaning early childhood services through post-secondary education and job training. And they should view that there's a continuum and there are junctures along that continuum where kids are either on the bus or they're not. And where there are problems in that continuum, you should be intervening. And that should be the way that you think about running your state's education system, K12, higher ed, early childhood, and so on. However, those data are rarely arrayed in a way for internal purposes or external purposes that have anybody thinking about it as such. And consequently, among the many other problems, you don't just get like people aren't urgent around fourth grade reading because that's predictive of this outcome. You get some of that. But really what you get is, oh my God, between May after a kid graduates as a senior and September when they start in higher education or whatever they're doing, there's nothing. Light bulb. And so until we start arraying data in a way that allows policymakers to see things as a continuum, we will get these gaps because the system is designed for those gaps to exist.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to open it up for questions in just a second, but Hanna, in John, as you think about this crowd and sort of this issue of connecting data and policy to technology, the private sector, sort of what's your charge to this group?
Continue to snip around the edges, but let's enter. Let's enter into the space where 50 million kids are just in the K12 and push the envelope. I say that knowing full well, and John, you've used some choice words around just the behemoth you hit. But I do think it's going to take a concerted effort, and I'll just circle back to the reason I'm so excited about this initiative that we're all able to work on is we're hoping, and so we would ask that you also help us change the conversation and have the end in mind and work backwards.
I would just say there are states that have taken a huge step forward on this issue, but many, many states have not, and that is, can you, as a taxpayer, as a citizen, as a school board member, what have you, actually say you understand what happens to the graduates of your school system in the long run? It is the case in most places that either because of lack of planning and competence, because of ridiculous laws, some around privacy, some otherwise, and in some cases just lack of investment, even the basic ability to say this young person graduated high school in 2000, by 2005, are they employed, are they credentialed, are they degreed, are they in debt? Most places just can't even begin to say that, including mine.
Yeah.
And it's for silly reasons, and I think if I were to ask people to advocate for one thing in this space, it probably would be, let's be able to make that connection in numbers in every place.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions right here.
I'm very sympathetic to this idea of having data so you can track what happens when you leave high school. Are you employed? Are you in school? What are you doing if you're employed and so forth. Ditto college, it came up in the college panel, if we could only track outcomes better. Where do you imagine we get this data? I mean, I was president of university for 20 years, and we don't know what people are doing 3 years out. The only way we can find out is by sending them surveys, and we get a 40% response rate. You can't get meaningful things from the BLS employment survey data because it's a sample. You can't get it from the census because it's not released. Even if you could, you can't. It doesn't. You won't necessarily get an identity of what high school did you go to. You might know how many years of schooling you had. You don't get it from IRS data. So there's a massive data collection effort that would be required to tag individuals and track them through their entire lives. In everybody, not comprehensively, not on a sampling basis, if you actually want to get down to the level of school accountability, school by school. So am I missing something? Are you imagining a data system that's very different from what we have now?
You're not, so I'm going to weigh in here. You're not missing that we cannot follow individual students at all, right? We can follow aggregate groups of students, and we can use some census data to look at what people are doing in their 20s, and then look at the checkpoints backwards. You can't follow the individual kids through the system. We don't have that ability.
Well, you can't. But even if you didn't attribute it, so I think you can't if you're trying to do it across states.
Right.
Thus some of the instruments, Rick, that you identified. But within states, I mean, I think the irony of all of this is that ultimately the education system is not a nationally managed system. At least the K12 system is not. It's a state-managed system. And the policies that govern this are largely states on their own or states interpreting federal mandates. So the levers are there, and the data are there. I mean, the income data are with the states. The employment data are with the states. The higher education data, including much more nuanced outcomes than you see in the clearinghouse and that kind of thing, are with the states. And certainly, as we've discussed, the K12 data are with the states. And there is a question, of course, how long do kids remain within states? But the fact of it is, and specifically, particularly, maybe tragically, in Louisiana and New Mexico, they tend to be within state. The income data, well, fair enough. So, but with the Department of Revenue in your state, with the Workforce Commission in your state, with the Higher Ed Commission in your state, you can create a student-by-student picture, and it may not be a 20-year picture. I'm not even sure you would want a 20-year picture. But for our purposes, of at least being able to go to a high school principal and saying, we know you're talking about a 90% graduation rate, but Half of your kids are unemployed within 4 years of them having graduated, and only 5% have completed even a 2-year credential. That's a serious piece of information. And you see that reality playing out. I mean, there are 90% graduation high schools today where you can say that the overwhelming majority, 90% of kids continue on an upward trajectory, and there's places where it's 10 to 20%. That is reported in almost no state system, that delta. And states have enough data, whether it's industry credentialing, whether it's job attainment, to actually meaningfully report what is happening.
I have a different question, but around the same metric. So I've been struggling with this issue around the mismatch in the sort of velocity of action. So government is designed for some good reasons and for some not so good reasons to move slowly. And particularly if you're looking at the world workforce, the velocity of innovation is almost dizzying. And so if you're linking that world of work and trying to link it back and setting up this prototype and hoping that the prototypes that you develop are going to drive action and policy into a system that acts slowly, how do you make that prototype dynamic enough to respond to the velocity of innovation, yet static enough to actually be meaningful?
Such a great question. I don't know. I mean, I would just say I think that's the tension, right? But from my vantage point, we've got to start. And I haven't seen a space where we really have created that through line yet. And it's not going to be perfect. And it is going to be cohort based at a, and at the aggregate level, et cetera. But until we begin, you can't push up against something until you have something to move, so to speak.
But part of it is that there's simply no way high schools, not that you were saying this, are ever going to be even within the same generation of velocity that private sector employers are in terms of their own programming. What they can be is more attuned to as kind of next stages, last mile providers, community colleges, the military, and actually understand that their role is simply not to credential kids and give them a piece of paper, but actually is to complete a handoff. I don't think it's actually about helping high schools redefine their programming as much as I might like that. It's helping them redefine their understanding of their role in the continuum of a young person's life, so that they're taking responsibility for a valid next step into an organization that has a better hope of having a higher velocity of evolution.
Hi, Isabel Howe at Imaginable Futures. Thank you for the thought-provoking vision across silos for a definition of success. Love it. I would like to challenge maybe or ask 2 questions. Why not start at birth? Why start at pre-K when all the learning science is very clear that learning starts at birth? And then on success, a lot of your comments were on employment, economic value of an individual's journey. Why not also expand that notion of success to happiness, well-being, and have even a more expanded notion of humans being success? Thank you.
Yeah.
You raised that.
Yeah, I can start. I think great pushes, and those are the pushes we've tried to embrace ourselves in the sense of how do we begin to have a bigger, broader picture. I mentioned, and this isn't getting to happiness per se, but we are looking at, and part of this is just data availability to the conversation a few minutes ago, around citizenship and voter turnout and volunteer rates, civic engagement. So we are trying to begin to look at a broader conversation, although still it will be imperfect, but a big constraint is the data actually. And is there data across states that we can use that is comparable, et cetera. So I think our starting point is, can we have enough data from enough states to have a larger and longer conversation about the start and end points?
I think on the early childhood question, it's more for, and Holly, you should certainly chime in here, I think it's more for, so far in our evolution, a lack of a consistent way of defining what's good versus bad with infants and toddlers, for example. But I would say this, the public reporting of what a state or a school system's what is good versus what is bad in the early childhood space is horrific. And partially because there is a fetishizing of pre-kindergarten, as you said, over all other programs. Pre-kindergarten is a relatively low enrollment program relative to, for example, to childcare and Head Start. It's only one part of the continuum of early childhood services. And in the absence of a comprehensive way of looking at all early childhood services that brings private and public, Head Start, childcare, and pre-Ks all together, we end up with publications releasing a very, very narrow shot of pre-K, which is a program that's fetishized largely on the left by politicians, but is just one small piece of the early childhood picture. And I hope that this instrument will get to a point where we're talking about all early childhood services. The risk I think you run is when you get out there and talk about how great it is that a state is doing tons and tons of childcare for their kids, you run up against the fact that you're not reporting how adequately that child is being cared for potentially at home. And I think we need to honor both of those perspectives, and we haven't figured out how you would even begin to talk about that dichotomy.
I mean, the challenge with this project, and I'm not in government anymore, so we just get to think about this, is there are people who've looked at state by state, K12 and into post-secondary. Part of the reason we don't go down any earlier or up any later is because the difficulty of putting it all together. And we're going to be waiting for decades if we don't just start with what we have. And so we're willing to say, let's start with what we have. Let's start the conversation. Let's figure out where the gaps are. Let's use that as an opportunity to talk about the fact that we have not very much information state by state on what early childhood and birth looks like, and talk about why that is and what we would like to see, and how do we use that in a more connected way.
Hi, Matt Gross. I'm with Newsella. So I'm a big supporter of data transparency. I was with New York State working with John King when he was started a P20 initiative, so data from pre-K through grade 20, which was not super successful. But one of the things that certainly we found as a business is the need to connect high-level data to data at a much lower, much smaller grain size. One of the issues with education in America, as I'm sure you know, is that it appears to be just a multi-generational stream of bad news, and the American public and American policymakers tend to tune out after, say, 2 or 3 decades of that bad news being delivered. My concern about the initiative, and I'm sure this is not the intention of it, is that if we're looking at all of the state's data and all it's ultimately doing is saying whether a state is a 0 stars or 1 star out of 5 stars, it's just going to feel like browbeating to the American public and policymakers. But if we're able to identify a smaller grain size of data where there are pockets of very good news, you see accelerated growth in whatever area it is, in graduation rates in certain school districts, or greater higher education attainment or job attainment or whatever, and you can diagnose that and replicate that, then it becomes a powerful instrument. Yeah. So my question is what is this designed to do? Are you taking this data and just splashing it into the trade publications and the national news to raise awareness of the real problems in education, or is this really an instrument for policymakers to take concerted action?
Go for it.
Great question, and we've talked a lot about this because you could take it from multiple angles. It could be just one of those moments of like, great, we already knew this. Things aren't going so well. But we're anticipating shining a light, number one, on the need for data and the importance of it in this conversation. 2, shining a light on looking from the end and looking backwards so that we begin a conversation that isn't so siloed. And 3, I would say also looking for those nuggets, to your point of, wait a minute, in Ohio, we see something interesting here in the pre-K space, and something interesting here in, and so that we can begin to have conversations that aren't just, do you have a good grad rate? Even though I think that's super important, right? But has a through line into a broader conversation and a hopefulness around what are the aha things? How do we push each other? Because, over there they're doing this and I didn't even know that was possible. So I would say we have a threefold desire, and I think we'll get more refined as we move through.
And a lot of this, frankly, came out of the kind of blend of pessimism, or the pessimism that comes out of the blend of using long-term, basically, instruments like the NAEP that are meant to measure very, very long-term social and academic trends, and then applying them to these short-cycle media reporting cycles where they just get the same old story and the media gets the same old hit time and time again. We want to broaden the field for what success looks like and find within that, contradictions in the data, so where there are bad outcomes here, there's actually something great happening here, and so on. And it creates some impetus for people then saying, wow, I can do this, I can step up and compete in this realm. And as simple as it is, the FAFSA, whether you think every kid filling out the FAFSA is a good idea or not, it started with states just competing. And our FAFSA completion rate went from 40% to 85%, tops in the country, largely because we were competing with Tennessee to be the top state. And that's a simple example of how, around a positive issue, using very, very simple data can drive people in some position of authority to actually step up and do new stuff rather than just think about their NAEP scores all day.
All right. Fabulous conversation. I'm giving you the hook now. And it really was. Thank you guys so much. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.